Today's scripture reading will be out of Philippians chapter 1, verses 21 through 23. And it reads, "For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I live on in the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor, yet what I shall choose I cannot tell. For I am hard pressed between the two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better."
Good morning. Winter has begun, hasn't it? In the Old Testament, there's a touching scenario that is described. In fact, it's codified into law. And a lot of people probably wouldn't think this would ever occur. And I'm going to describe it to you in just a minute, but when I tell you, you'll understand why I'm saying what I'm saying. Most people would think that this scenario would be an impossibility, and at least an improbability. And this is the scenario. Someone goes into servitude, into slavery. It's often referred to as a servant or a slave, and if you understand the Old Testament, it's a little bit different in some cases than some might understand slavery or forced servitude. Sometimes these people would be put in charge of entire households. They would become household managers. If you remember Joseph in the Old Testament, you know that was his job, at least momentarily in his life for a brief period of time. He was only under the master of the household, the fellow that owned it all, and so. Anyway, that was the life of the day, and many times these folks were simple servants, and sometimes they could be high-ranking individuals. But all that being said, at the end of that forced service, that indentured time period, if a servant decided, and you can call them what you want, I use the term servant, biblical translation can be servant or slave, but at the end of their time period, you would think that it would be like the last day of school in third grade. You know, the bell rings and everybody quietly walks out, right? Well, I hate to say it, but in my school, we ran for the door like the building was on fire, you know. But we were screaming and laughing and yoo-hoo, you know, it's summer and all that good stuff. And you would think that a person who had lived a life of that kind of service, that kind of servitude, of being forced to do so, you would think they'd run for the door. But that wasn't always the case. In fact, some servants had the opportunity to request of the master to become what would otherwise be known as a bondservant or a bondslave. And that person could request of their master to become their voluntary servant for the rest of their life. And the procedure was, if the master was to accept that, the master would take the servant up to the door and put their earlobe over the doorpost and pierce it with an awl. And we even have songs today that use the phraseology, "pierce my ear," in reference to our voluntary service to God. If you look at the New Testament and you see the life of the apostles, particularly the more detail we get of apostolic service, the more we find this bond servant sort of attitude. It's one that says, Lord, if you and the thing about being a servant is you got to still do your job. You got to do what the master says you got to do. You might be going into town one day for supplies, and you might be cleaning out the sheep pen on the next day. It might be inglorious. It could be hard. It could be difficult labor. But where the master needed you, you went. And in the New Testament, when we find the gospel spreading, we find it with people who are going where God wants them to go, more than where they want to be. When we look at the life of Paul, Paul makes this great statement to the Philippian people. He says, "For to me To live is Christ, and to die is gain. That's Paul's way of saying, I wish the door was open and God gave me a choice. And he'd say, Paul, do you want to come home to your reward, or would you rather stay down there on earth and keep on doing what you're doing? Paul's saying, take me home, Lord. That's what I would rather. You see, the difference between religion and a relationship is that when you have a relationship, you want to go home. Religion tries to preserve the status quo. Don't change me. Don't challenge me. Don't have me think anything that's difficult to think. Don't have me look in my spiritual mirror and ask tough questions about my own soul. Just sit me in a pew and make me feel good and send me home. And on the day of judgment, everything will be okay, right? What does the Bible tell you if you fail to repent and change your life to God's wisdom? Everything's going to be okay. I'd rather somebody tell me. It's always interesting if you go to get your oil changed. I don't know what place you go. If you might do it yourself at home. I prefer doing my own. I've had more frustration. I'm not even going to get that. I don't even want to go down that line. That's a whole 3 or 4 sermon series. I don't even want to talk about that. But if you go to get your oil changed, sometimes they'll come out with these little vials of fluid. It might be antifreeze, it could be your oil, it could be any number of things, and it'll be different colorations. And they'll say, oh, Mr. Braswell, your antifreeze is like 42 years old. You got to get in here and change that stuff. Now, he's not being dishonest with you. He's not even telling me something I don't know. But I didn't come here to get another $100 charge. I just want my oil changed. And sometimes in life we hear things that we don't want to hear, but we have to hear them. Sometimes I've been around mechanics that can listen to an engine and they can tell you by what they hear what that engine is doing. In other words, they can tell you if it's healthy. I had a 1982 Ford, I think it was 82 or 83 Ford Ranger pickup, one of the first ones. It had a V6 and it had an engine that sounded like a sewing machine. You start that thing up and it was clack, 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 tick, 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 all over. And every engine I'd ever heard in my life is supposed to be quiet. Not that engine. I took it in, the Ford mechanic came outside, he smiled at me, he said, you never owned one of these before, have you? And I said, no, sir. He said, that engine is as healthy. He said, it'll last forever, but it's going to sound terrible the entire time it runs. He said, if it stops making noise, that's when you got to worry. I said, okay. So I went back home. Sometimes we want a faith that nobody challenges us. Nobody hears anything. Nobody sees anything. I want everybody to tell me everything is okay. And there are times when we need to hear those things. I'm not saying that sermons and our interactions should always be negative and should always be challenging, but if they're not at some point going to help us to change, what are we doing? Because we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And the world is lost and it is dead. And I'm not saying it because I'm morbid or because I'm cynical or because I'm pessimistic. I'm telling you what God is saying and seeing. He wants us to be raised up to that newness of life. As Paul said, for me to live is Christ, to die is gain. I would love, says Paul, I would love to be out of here because that's going to be when I get my reward. But this is what he says, for me to live is Christ. For me to travel on, for me to move forward, for me to be what I am in relationship with Him to be, then I'm going to have to do whatever He needs me to do, wherever He needs me to be. If He needs me to be here, then I'll be here. I recently saw a message a day or two ago, I think it was yesterday. A good friend of mine in Killen, Alabama, Killen, Alabama, passed away. His name was Manson Beal. Manson was a former elder. He preached for many congregations. He was not a full-time minister, but he was a sought-after teacher. In the congregation at Killen where I was easily, and there were usually 3 or 4 Bible classes every Sunday morning. His Bible class was, he had to move into bigger and bigger and bigger rooms. And Manson was old school. When I say old school, I'm not referring to his age. I'm talking about how he went about teaching the Bible. It was scripture this and that, and he just went, and he would commit it to memory. There were times, I remember, I won't get into all the examples, but there were times when Manson would walk into a room with a Bible, and there are people that would feel like the cavalry had arrived. And there were some people that thought, I wish he'd leave that Bible at home, because he was probably going to say something they didn't want to hear. But he kept it with him. You see, and Manson had I don't know exactly what his physical issue was, but he had a limp, and he had a device that was on his leg, and he would walk with, every time I'd see him, he had a specific gait, and I could always tell. But some other things about him, he had a smile. When he would smile, he would almost look up to heaven, and his teeth would all show. I don't know where he got that from or why he did that, but that was him. I always thought to myself, one day when I grow up and become a preacher, I'd like to be just like him. He was a black and white man in a color world, if you understand what I'm saying. Anybody ever had a black and white TV and then bought a color one? It's amazing how things change. But he just had a very simplistic way to approach things, and it gave stability to a world that is inconsistent and chaotic and troubled. Because for him, the simple answer was to live for Christ. To live for the Lord in a world that is struck. Oh, well, what do we do? What do we do? We run around like our hair's on fire. Calm down. I was playing Little League Baseball one time, and I couldn't hit very well initially, and I didn't know that I needed glasses. And so nobody knew I needed glasses. Till one day I was in school and took one of those eye tests. And they said, that boy needs glasses. So I went, got a pair of glasses, started hitting the ball. And I was not bragging or anything, but as a little fella, I was actually doing pretty well. But then I stopped. For some reason, it's like you hit a slump, they call it. And I wasn't playing well. It seemed like everything was wrong. My fielding was off, my throwing was off, my batting was off. And I remember my coach just telling me, you just got to play through it. You just got to keep going. You can't quit because things get tough. I thought I couldn't play baseball anymore. He looked at me and smiled. He said, every kid on this team has a point in time when they're going to struggle. You're no different. You're not special in that regard like everybody else. You can't just give up. When we think about things in this world and we want to try to figure out how to get better, sometimes if you want to live a faithful life in this world, you just got to keep putting one faithful foot in front of the other. And you got to walk through the storm. And you got to keep walking through the storm to the cross. But I can tell you what's going to happen if you stop and you start to look at the storm and you start to survey yourself. You know what happened to Peter in those waves. He sank, right? He didn't sink because he couldn't walk on the water. Because if the Lord calls you out of the boat to walk on the water, you can walk on the water. Even if you've never done it before, you can walk on the water. But if you stop believing the Lord and you start looking around you, then maybe we forget that to live is Christ. And this morning, I just want to share with you a few examples of what people sometimes live for. Sometimes people live for pleasure. They don't live for Jesus, they live for pleasure. Everything is about comfort. Luke 15:13, and not many days later, the younger son, remember the prodigal story of the parable of the prodigal son? The younger son gathered everything together and went on a journey into a distant country, and there He squandered the estate with loose living. Remember the scenario? The young man walks into his dad and he says, Father, I want you to give me my inheritance now. When do people usually get an inheritance? When somebody has what? Died. That's like a young man walking into their father or a young daughter, whatever the case is, but they walk into their father or mother and they say, give me my inheritance. I don't care if you're alive. I don't care what you've worked for. I don't care what you've done. I want you to give me, and they don't say it, but this is what they mean. I want you to give me what you owe me. Let me tell you a second thing about an inheritance. It is not owed to you. It might be a gift to you, but it's not owed. A lot of kids wind up in court after parents pass away because they find out when the will is read, they get a surprise. You're getting zero, zilch. There's reasons that happens. Some are good and some are not. But this young man walks into his father and he says, give me my inheritance like it belongs to him. And then he goes out and he wastes it. I wonder at what point he's in the pig pen that he thought to himself, and we know that the time comes, but this is not a thought that just dawns on you like miraculously. He's got to be walking in that pig pen thinking, I hate this job. I hate feeding these pigs. I don't like these pigs. I have nothing personal against the pigs, but they don't smell good. I don't know if y'all ever been around a pig pen. It's not exactly something you're looking for an air freshener to duplicate that atmosphere, you know. And he sat in there, and he got so hungry because he was so broken. All those friends who were around him when he was having a good time and things were going well, where were they? They weren't feeding him. They weren't housing him. They weren't helping him. I don't know how people who are rich ever find a mate in this world. Because it's got to be somewhere in the back of your mind. Unless you've known somebody all your life, it's got to be somewhere in the back of your mind. Is it just my money that's brought them into my life? And that's a valid question. So the pleasure of the moment is what so many people live for. And they live for that in their spiritual life. You know, so many times when when the description of us growing is given to us in the Bible, it's things like being smelted. In other words, being melted down so that the dross can be taken off. But I'm going to tell you something. The melting down part is not easy. That's not a symbol of pleasure. It's not a symbol of ease. God puts us on the anvil to form us. I don't know about you, but getting hit with a hammer, have you ever done that? You will not want to do it again. In fact, you may quit the job you're on at that moment for a little while. I've seen people do dances. I've seen people throw hammers. I have seen people, unfortunately, I've heard people say things that they shouldn't have said. But all of that, because that hurts. It's painful. And sometimes we want to grow up and we want to be strong and we want to be righteous and we want to be holy, but we don't want to get hit with the hammer. I don't want to be in the melting pot. And some people say, well, the world is just so full of so much pain and there's so much going on. I can't let God form me. Well, let me give you a piece of understanding. It doesn't matter who you are in this room or in this world. It hurts. Okay? Everybody hurts in some way, shape, or form. We're all growing. We're developing scar tissue from previous wounds, or we've just been scarred from a recent wound. And we're trying to figure out how to not get wounded again. But the answer to life is not to make pleasure our God. The answer to life is to grow from the stress that we face. How do I deal with the problems that want to consume me and overwhelm me? It's not by looking at the world and saying, y'all be nice and everybody be... Well, I wish everybody would be nice. I really do. I wish folks would act like Jesus, and imagine what the world would be like if that was the case. What kind of world would we live in if everybody acted like the Lord? Would it not be a radically different place? It would be so different. It would be literally heaven on earth. I mean, as close as we could get it here, that's what it would be. But making pleasure our God is not the solution. Now, for some people, they become a little more introverted in their perspective, and we want to make popularity what we live for. Some people are very gregarious people. A gregarious person is a person that walks in the room and very friendly, very open. Many times they'll walk into it. Everybody likes them, usually. Not everybody. Some people will be jealous. But a gregarious person will walk up to Adam, give him a big old hug. I mean, not now, but, when we get to that point again in life, go up and give Adam a big old hug and oh, Adam, you're like, it's just so, and there's nothing wrong as long as it's genuine. That's a good thing. But let me tell you, some people are not so genuine. Some people will be one thing to you publicly, and then privately you'll be digging the knife out of your back when they walk away. Because the most important thing to them is being popular. And we read in Mark 15 and verse 15, wishing to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas for them, and after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. Pilate was so twisted. I've got to believe he didn't believe Jesus was the Son of God. Because I don't think anybody who truly believes that would have done what Pilate did. But Pilate made the decision he made because it was easy for him to do. It was easy. Anybody ever heard of the Herodian Dynasty in the Old Testament? Actually, in the New is where it existed, pardon me. They existed in both. The Herods were people, it was a family, a Jewish family that ruled ruthlessly. They were cruel. Most of them, the vast majority, came to power by killing the predecessor. So if it was your cousin, your mom, your dad, your brother, your sister, and you wanted to be on the throne, well, something just happened to them. Wheel came off the chariot mysteriously. They died of a disease, probably poison. Or, they were out walking with the sheep and the sheep ate them one day. All kinds of weird stuff happened. But they came to power. When the Romans came in, the Romans displaced all kingdoms and leaderships, but they took over a particular area of Israel that they couldn't tame it. No matter how many soldiers they sent down there, no matter what they did, they couldn't tame it. So this is what they did. They brought the Herods back. And they said, this is your area. And again, they went in and they were ruthless. They did what the invading army would not do. That's how ruthless all of that was. But they maintained their popularity through fear. You ever heard of some of these foreign elections where a person is elected by 100% of the vote? Saddam Hussein was continually elected by 100% of the vote. Did you know that? You would think, well, that dude's popular. He sure was with everybody he looked at. Because nobody was going to look at him and say no. He was popular because people were afraid of him. In their hearts, he wasn't popular. They were just simply afraid and fearful. Another thing that people live for is possession. Luke 12:19. I'll say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and what? Be merry. Be merry. Oh, my stuff. My stuff. One of my favorite superheroes, cartoon figure called the Tick. And the only real power he had was he was just nigh indestructible. He wasn't smart. He was very strong. You just couldn't get rid of him. And the bad guys couldn't stand him because for that reason. They just could. He was always in the way, and he was a good guy. But I never will forget, of all the things he said that I remember, It was this. A big force comes to the earth and they want to destroy the earth. And the tick looks at him and says, you can't destroy the earth because that's where all my stuff is. You know? I think some folks, that's what they look at life. Where's my stuff? And if they don't have the stuff they think they ought to have. Well, life isn't what it should be because I don't have the stuff that somebody else has got. And why does somebody else have stuff I don't have? Did you ever wonder about why you got stuff somebody else doesn't have? Usually that line of thought doesn't go that way. But sometimes that's where people are at. Possession. What do I own? Look what I've got. It's really sad that we tend, and I'm talking about people, tend to quantify and qualify their life by what they surround themselves with in terms of stuff. And they don't want to brag about it, but they want you to know about it. I just blah, and this is, and I was helping a preacher move one time. His name was Hugh Minor. Hugh has passed away, and he was actually moving up to British Columbia, and I didn't know much about Canadian geography. But I'm helping him move, and he said in just a minute the truck is going to bring by the last thing, and then we're going to load up and drive to where we have to go. And the truck pulled up, and it had a 40-foot boat on it. A 40-foot, I never knew this man even got in the water. Man had a 40-foot boat. It was huge. And I looked at Hugh and I said, Hugh, I didn't know you had a boat. He said, well. And that's all he said. And I said, I hope British Columbia has at least one lake around it. Well, it's, a lot of water in British Columbia. He said, yeah, they might have a lake or two up there. But see, he never talked about it. And that's fine. I didn't have any problem with the fact that the man owned it. It surprised me. You think you know everything about your preacher. I'm not hiding any boats, by the way, in case y'all are wondering. I don't have any boats or second or third homes or, nothing like that. But all that being said, our stuff, the sad thing is sometimes our things own us. You ever bought that brand new car and then it gets its first scratch? Oh, it's got a scratch on it. Well, if you drive them, I don't have trailer queens or garage queens. Everything I've got, I ride or drive. I own it to be transported by it. And it's not perfect. It's going to have scratches. I don't know what, I can tolerate a scratch. I can't stand dents. I don't know why that is. Don't ask me. It's a personal problem. I don't know what that's about. I should have been a body man maybe. I don't know. But sometimes we get so worried about things. We get that new rug put in. And then what happens when you drop something on it? I went into, a sister invited me over for dinner one evening. Laura and I show up. And we walked in the house. Now, you got to understand, in the South, it's not always, in fact, it's rarely customary to remove your shoes when you walk in. Sometimes you do, but many times you do not. That's okay. It depends on the household and who's there. And it's no big deal. But in the North, many times it's more often the case that you take your shoes off when you walk in, and that's okay. But I was still a Southern kid trying to learn these, and I walk in there, and I look down, and she has white carpet. And I'm like, oh man, you better not even breathe in this place. Don't even, I took my shoes off and I thought maybe I'll take my socks off. I don't know if it's going to work or not, She was perfectly fine about it. She wasn't neurotic or anything. I mean, the woman had white carpet and she invited people over for dinner on a regular basis. So apparently she was unafraid, unafraid. Miss Lil knows what I'm saying. She didn't worry about it. The good thing was she was married to a man. If that carpet got messed up, I'm pretty sure I knew what he was going to be buying pretty quick. New carpet. But what happens when our things own us? What happens when what I've got, my whole life is based around that thing? Like the old Hobbit character. And I can't remember his name, but he had the ring, Precious, remember? And when Precious was missing, his whole life was gone. Everything he lived for, to guard it, to protect it, to have it. And it was over. And if you're wondering how close this hits to home, do you know that in the first Depression that the suicide rate went through the roof because people lost all their money? Lost all their money. A lot of people lost everything. But for those people for whom that was everything, they had nothing left to live for. Those are things. Finally, power. In Genesis 10, verses 8 and 9, now Cush became the father of Nimrod. He became a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. For some people, it's power. We live in a time, unfortunately, where young men in particular, and young women, fall into these image categories. And this is by their own volition, but they're sort of pushed into it by society. You got to have a certain body type. You got to have a certain look. You got to have a certain performance level. And you got to be able to do this, and you got to be able to do that. And a friend of mine sent me a picture of my first overseas deployment, and we were actually in Istanbul, Turkey. We were all wearing civilian clothes because in order to go on this tour, we had to wear civilian clothes. I'm not going to get into what I was wearing because you'd laugh. It was fashionable for the day, but actually not so much. But we were there. And it was about 8 or 10 of us, and I was trying to remember who everybody was. And then I thought to myself, I looked at that group. In fact, the gentleman that sent me that picture became a cornerback for Auburn University. He wanted to play football at Auburn University. A good friend of mine. We worked out together, and his name was Tom, and I love him dearly. But so we were there, and I was thinking back, and I was thinking, man, and I was in that picture, and I saw that picture. And I'm thinking, you don't look anything like that picture anymore. You just don't. The only time I've ever kicked anybody out of my house, a young teenager, Adam, came over to my house as a young man. And of course, like any home, we have pictures on the wall and stuff like that. And he went up to a picture, and I couldn't tell what he was looking at. And he said, Lonnie, I got a question for you. And I said, what is that? This was in St. Louis, early 2000s. And he said, who is that man helping Miss Laura off the stage with her wedding dress on? I said, get out. I don't even want to see you anymore. Get out of here. I don't want to see your face. Of course, I was just kidding with him. But power, you know, that strength, that ability, you feel like you can run forever, you can do anything. Or maybe it's social power. I can tell somebody what to do and they better get it done. I've seen a lot of people who pose for power. You know, they're not really powerful, but they want to tell you and you better listen to what I'm telling you. Why should I listen to you? You know? You become less serious the more you exercise this fake power you think you've got. Power. For some people, it's all they live for, and when they don't have it anymore, you know what happens to the CEO when he's got to retire and he's no longer the CEO? What happens when, and I had a gentleman one time who was a military guy, was a colonel. He was a very, very, very good soldier, and he commanded tough units. He was a Ranger commander. He was something else. But what was funny, he married a woman, a member of the church, this wonderful lady. Her name was Olga. And he would come home, and he had to leave his colonel stuff on the porch before he came in the house. Because if he started throwing orders around to Miss Olga, he had a force he couldn't contend with. He could command Rangers and conquer territory. But when he walked in his house, it was a different story. And she was a good woman. But she was not in the military. She reminded him. What happens when you worship power and you don't have it? For me to live is Christ. If for me to live is anything but Jesus, when it's gone, my life is gone. If I live for something other than Jesus, when it disappears or it is subtracted from existence, then my life is taken with it. And that's the beauty of living for Christ, because He's not going anywhere. He's with us. He's with us when our friends don't want to be around us. He's with us when it's hard times. He's with us when it's glorious. He's the one that brought us the glory. Do you realize that when you have a success in life, when you get to be the employee of the month or whatever that is, that comes from the Lord? You may have worked well, you may have worked hard, but it comes from Him. And we need to thank Him for that. Every paycheck, every day you live a life when it's cold. I feel good in here, so somebody's uncomfortable. You know, somebody's cold and somebody's warm. I'm not going to ask for a raise of hands. I know you're out there. I love you nonetheless. But it's snowy outside. It's dry in here. It's not icy. It's a good place to be. And when it's really cold, it'll be warm in here. And when it's really hot, it may not be as cool as we might want. It might be too cool for you. But it'll be cool in here. That comes from God. This building, now you might say, I'm not saying that this building is holy. People are holy. God is holy. But this building is a blessing. I've worshiped in a lot of places around the world where it was outside, and whatever was outside with you. Sometimes it's very beautiful. I worshiped on a hillside in Scotland, and we sang hymns, and the sheep from the pasture walked over to us to listen to us. We were curious. And Lil, I don't know if it's because we were good or bad, but the sheep came over to see what that noise was over there, and they gathered around us while we were singing. It's a beautiful thing to belong to Jesus. I hope you've made that choice. I hope that when you tally what you live for in this world, that you can say, I live for the Lord. Now, I might do a lot of things, and I might be successful in areas, and I might struggle in areas, but when it comes to what founds my life, it is Jesus. I belong to Him. I am His servant, and if He wants me here, I'll be here, and the day He calls me home, I am going home. And if there's a spiritual third grade bell that goes off in Lonnie's life, I'm going to run out that door like the building's on fire. And if I go before you, I will meet you when you get there. But you're not going to hear a story from me. Well, I got to heaven and the Lord told me I'd come back. So I came back. And if you tell me that story, I'm going to tell you should have stayed. If you got to heaven and the Lord said, well, I'll let you go back home or stay here. What do you want to do? You better just stay right where you are. Because we're coming. We'll get there. I hope and pray what you live for is Jesus. It'll change your life. If you're not doing it right now and you start doing it, it will change your life. It'll change the way you see people. It'll change the way you see yourself. I can't promise you it's going to change folks around you. I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that if you become a Christian, all of your troubles are going to go away and you know, everything. Now, the big things will go away. Your guilt, your lostness, your being dead in this world spiritually, all that's going to change because you're going to be raised up to a newness of life. Romans chapter 6 tells us the whole detailed event. But that neighbor you don't get along with, well, they're probably still going to be hard to get along with, maybe. Unless you're the problem. But we ain't thinking about that, are we? I hope that you'll live for the Lord. I hope that you'll put the things, if you have them in your life that we've discussed, behind you and away from you. And that you'll kneel at the cross and let God direct you. Look at His Word. Observe His will and His wisdom in this world. I mentioned Manson to you. And I'll tell you, it's for me personally, I try to be mindful of people who have impacted me severely spiritually. And I will tell you this, I thought for a minute, sometimes you need to take a break. And maybe you don't need to preach that Sunday. But if I had told you I was mourning for my friend and I would not get in this pulpit, Manson would come up out of the grave. What are you thinking? I know him. Those are the kinds of people that we need in our life. We need people who will challenge us, who, when we want to lay down, say we're tired, they're going to say, get up. You got to walk. You can't curl up in the spiritual fetal position and give up. Now you can hurt, but hurt while you're walking. You can, if you want to complain, be very careful about it. In fact, I would recommend you don't, but if you feel like you have to, do it while you're walking. I think of great people who I find to be great examples, and of course the greatest is Jesus. Jesus gave his life for us. None of the other things I've mentioned have sacrificed a single thing. For that pleasure, that power, the possessions, they don't care about us. Couldn't care less. Your car has no idea who owns it. I hate to tell you that, even though you talked to it, maybe you named it. Doesn't care. Your house, yeah, you got to take care of it and you got to be responsible, but it doesn't care about you. Because if you don't fix it, guess what it'll do? Fall apart. Like all man-made things. It will dilapidate and eventually turn into dust. Because we can't create things like God. This morning, I encourage you, if you're not a Christian, make that choice today. Make the choice to belong to God. And then follow him and let nothing take the place of Jesus. To live is Christ. And if you are a Christian, and for some reason you like the prayers of this congregation, please come while we stand, while we sing.